Joining us now is a candidate for running for Congress in New York's 6th district, Mel Gagarin. Welcome to the conversation.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Very glad to have you here. I know we talked a little bit earlier on the race, but I'm excited to get an update on that, introduce you to some more people. So for those who might not have seen the first time that we spoke, who are you? What are you bringing to this race?
So my name's Mel Gagarin. A progressive Democrat that's challenging Grace Meng, who's the current incumbent here in New York 6th congressional district. And we are fighting to join this movement that's been growing here throughout Queens. Proud to be part of a slate of candidates that includes obviously Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as a brand new Congress endorsed candidate. And we are fighting to bring all of the progressive change that we need that is going to center marginalized communities and working class folk back in the conversation that hasn't been happening with the establishment and under this current administration.
Yeah, and New York in particular has had some issues at the state level with that. Let's talk about your background. You have been involved in a number of different areas of politics, more than most people that we talk to. So run me through some of that experience.
I'm sorry, can you say that last part again? I lost you.
So just run us through some of the past political work, activism that you've been involved in.
Sure. Yeah. So I used to work for the state senator here. I worked for Congressman Anthony Weiner for a bit before I left electoral politics and went to do public policy advocacy in the nonprofit space at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I worked at Planned Parenthood in New York City for a bit. And most recently doing criminal justice reform work at the intersection of higher education and women's rights, trying to increase access to higher education for currently and formerly incarcerated folks. Eventually found myself volunteering on the Caban campaign, and going around here in Queens, seeing all of the energy and hunger that folks have for progressive policies, really inspired me to take the dive and run for Congress. Because if there was ever a time for a progressive movement to really have an impact and a wide-ranging impact to finally make change, it's now.
It's interesting because when I think of the stereotypical lives that candidates come from, lawyers are going to be overrepresented, people in business, sometimes doctors or career politicians. It seems to be much more common, and even as you pointed out, there's this sort of thing happening in New York where people are coming with a background, a broad background in activism. I know that the former lawyers are going to say, well, you need to understand the law if you're going to pass laws. So what do you think, moving into the House, having this background in activism, what does that bring as an alternative?
Sure. I mean, it's not even just my background in activism, it's just the lived experience, right? My opponent, she comes from a political family. The vast majority of her career, she's been a politician. In the crisis that we face now, we don't need politicians. Politicians aren't what's going to get us out of this mess. It's going to be people with the lived experiences. Like, I grew up in a one-bedroom apartment with my mom, who was a nurse, and my abuela, who helped raise me because my dad wasn't around. And I lived that working class experience. I went to do the work that I did because I was always motivated to serve others. I wanted to work to improve the system that we were working in. And I think that type of experience is missing in Congress. I think we have a handful of electeds that have made it thanks to this progressive movement that's been sweeping the country, but it's not enough. And what we need is a real firewall that's going to advocate on behalf of working families and working folk who have been left out of the conversation for so long.
I've seen that you said that the last time that you ran for a political office, which was way back in 2009, there wasn't the same sort of infrastructure, the same sorts of organizations. Talk to me about some of the ways that what's been developed since then is important for candidacies like yours.
I mean, I think the most important thing is that there really is a movement. It's not just like, we see, I know one of my fellow we share volunteers. We coordinate with each other. We're working together. There really is this sense that it's not just us as individuals running. That there is an entire cadre of folks throughout this borough and throughout the city, really, who are really working together and coordinating our efforts to make sure that we all make it, right. It really is sort of that not me us idea that you hear coming out of the Sanders campaign, and we're putting it into practice.
And so you have these these organizations, you also, thanks to, in no small part, those organizations, the last time around, you have some incumbents now who ran as progressives. They have continued to legislate as progressives. How important is it to have people like AOC and Ilhan Omar and other members of the squad who've sort of shown that this sort of campaign can win?
I mean, it's incredibly important because you're always, especially as a challenger, everybody's telling you what you can't do. And what those amazing women have shown us is that it is possible to be an elected official that stands on principle, that is going to legislate on principle, and that they can win, right? Because when you look at, to take AOC for example, everybody these days they support the Green New Deal. Here you have a freshman Congress member who's already introduced 2 pieces of legislation that takes that from framework into implementation, and you have incumbents that have been there like mine for 8 years who say they support the Green New Deal yet have nothing to show for it.
Yeah. So we've talked about your history. Obviously, you've been involved in activism around a few different issues. So now you're campaigning. What are some of the core issues that you're focusing on?
Housing is definitely one of them. We have a homelessness crisis throughout this country, and we see it here in New York, where we have over 62,000 folks that are home insecure. 20,000 of those, which are families. I'm a supporter of a homes guarantee. I mean, housing is a human right. I don't believe that in the richest country in the world, anyone deserves to die in the street. Especially with everything that's going on internationally right now. I really believe that we need a new foreign policy, that we need to divest from the war machine. I don't take any money for the military-industrial complex. Unfortunately, I can't say the same for my opponent. I mean, she voted against the Iran deal, for instance, and no one wants these wars anymore. And when I go around and talk to people in the community, they want to see investment right here. They don't want to see us entering another endless war. They don't want to see another generation that gets lost and sacrificed to another boondoggle in the Middle East.
I definitely want to get into your opponent in just a minute. So look, we obviously over the past few weeks we came what felt like very close to a full all-out conflict with Iran. There's still very much the chance that while Donald Trump is president, that could happen. If you were in office right now, what would you be working towards? What can be done to constrain that sort of conflict? And if we get a Democratic president in the future, what should the legislature do to stop rogue presidents from launching us into these endless wars?
Right, and look, I think that fundamentally the first mistake that was made is that Congress sort of relegated its authority over its war powers. So that was mistake number one. When we had the Iran deal, like I said, my opponent ended up voting against the Iran deal even after it was implemented. She tried to undermine it by voting to put backdoor sanctions on Iran, even though the Obama administration had been very adamant about saying that this would not help meet our foreign policy goals. What we need is to rethink what our foreign policy is, instead of thinking about the military as our first stop. I mean, when watching the debate last night, I found it sort of instructive that every candidate got asked maybe 2 or 3 different scenarios in which they would use the military, but they were never asked what their foreign policy would be that would make sure that we never entered in these wars in the first place. And look, I'm not naive. It's not that it's going to be an easy solution, but it's what's demanded of us, right? Like that's our job as legislators. That's our job to protect our country and to protect, our resources and our people, is to make sure that we have a foreign policy that is not putting the war machine at the forefront and be the automatic answer that we lean on.
So you've mentioned the current Democratic incumbent you're running against is Grace Meng, who's held the seat since 2013. You've mentioned her opposition to the Iran deal, which certainly sets her apart from most Democrats. What are some of the other areas that you're stressing as differentiating factors as you're campaigning?
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's absolutely one of those differentiating factors because it's someone that wants to pass off as a progressive and that that they're doing the job of a Democrat, but it's not the case. I mean, when you look at her foreign policy, she's in lockstep with President Trump, right? I mean, after he railed against the Iran deal in the 2009 State of the Union, she put out a statement saying that she stands ready to work with the president. And that's absurd to me because we know who this man is. And that's acting as if he had some type of sensible foreign policy, which we know he doesn't. We know that he's reckless. We know he's a danger to this country. And we need to stand against that. And that's one of those differences that I think is important to hammer home because it's one of the most critical things that I think affects not just my generation, but the generation coming up. I have 3 children. I don't want to see my son have to be shipped off to war one day because, we had members of Congress that were willing to look the other way that called themselves Democrats and then went ahead and voted with Republicans.
So if Donald Trump does get reelected, but you win, should I put you down as not standing ready to work with the president?
Absolutely, I will be a big roadblock to President Trump's presidency and really take the fight to him because that's what we need. Look, I'm a hardscrabble kid from Queens too, and I'm ready to take the fight on to this president because we can't politic our way out of the moment that we're in. I think that what we need is elected officials that recognize the danger that Donald Trump poses, and that are going to fight him every step of the way and not cede ground to this presidency.
Where can people find out more about your candidacy?
They can go to www.melforprogress.com. We could use any small donations. We are not taking any corporate PAC money. I've signed the code PINK, Divest from the War Machine Pledge. I've signed the Sunrise Pledge and not taking fossil fuel money. We're totally people powered. So you can learn more about me there and hopefully please support the campaign because we're going to need everything we can to combat the big dollars that our incumbent takes.
Awesome. Well, Mel Gagarin running in New York 6th District. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.